The year is 1849. A young woman stands alone in the Maryland woods at midnight, her heart racing as she listens for the sound of dogs in the distance. Her name is Araminta Ross, though the world will come to know her as Harriet Tubman. She has just escaped from slavery, leaving behind her family, her husband, and everything familiar. She is alone, terrified, and nearly 100 miles from freedom. But this is just the beginning of her story, because Harriet Tubman won't just escape to freedom and live quietly in the North. She will return to the South 19 times, risking recapture and death to lead more than 70 people to freedom. She will become the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, a woman with a price on her head and a reputation that will make slave owners tremble. This is her story. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross around 1822 on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. The exact date of her birth was never recorded, as it rarely was for enslaved children. She was one of 9 children born to Harriet Green and Ben Ross, both enslaved on different plantations owned by the Brodess family. From her earliest days, Araminta, who would later take her mother's name Harriet, knew only the harsh reality of slavery. Maryland's Eastern Shore was a region of small farms and plantations, where tobacco had once been king but was now giving way to wheat and timber. The enslaved population in the area lived under the constant threat of being sold south to the brutal cotton plantations of the Deep South, a fate considered worse than death by many. Families were routinely separated, children torn from their mothers, husbands from wives, all in the name of profit. Harriet's childhood was marked by violence and hardship. At the age of 5 or 6, she was hired out to a woman who forced her to check muskrat traps in icy rivers while suffering from measles. When she became too sick to work, she was sent back to her owner as useless. At 7, she was hired out again, this time to a woman who beat her regularly for minor infractions. The scars on Harriet's neck from those beatings would remain for the rest of her life. But the event that would define Harriet's life came when she was about 13 years old. She was in a dry goods store when an enslaved man ran in, pursued by an overseer. The overseer demanded that Harriet help restrain the man. She refused. As the enslaved man fled, the overseer grabbed a 2-pound weight and threw it. He missed his target, and the weight struck Harriet in the forehead with terrible force. The injury was catastrophic. Harriet's skull was fractured, and she nearly died. She lay unconscious for days, and when she finally woke, she was never the same. For the rest of her life, she suffered from seizures, severe headaches, and episodes where she would suddenly fall into a deep sleep, sometimes in the middle of a conversation. These sleeping spells, likely a form of narcolepsy caused by the head injury, would plague her for decades. But Harriet turned even this disability into a kind of strength. During these episodes, she experienced vivid dreams and visions that she believed were messages from God. She became deeply religious, seeing her life as guided by divine providence. This faith would sustain her through the dangerous work that lay ahead and give her a fearlessness that others found remarkable. In 1844, Harriet married John Tubman, a free black man. The marriage gave her the right to use his surname, but it didn't change her legal status as enslaved. She hoped that her husband would support her desire for freedom, but John was content with the life they had. When Harriet began talking about escaping north, John dismissed her dreams and even threatened to tell her master if she tried to run. The breaking point came in 1849 when Harriet learned that she and several of her siblings were about to be sold south. Her master, Edward Brodess, had died, and his widow was selling off enslaved people to pay debts. Harriet knew this was her last chance. She would run, with or without her husband's support. Harriet tried one last time to convince John to come with her. She painted a picture of life in the free states, of owning their own home, of raising free children. But John refused, and worse, he mocked her dreams. Some accounts suggest he threatened to turn her in if she didn't stop talking about escape. Heartbroken but determined, Harriet made her decision. She would go alone. On a September night in 1849, Harriet Tubman began her journey to freedom. She left with 2 of her brothers, but they quickly became frightened and turned back, forcing Harriet to return with them. But a few nights later, she set out again, this time alone. She had roughly 90 miles to travel to reach Pennsylvania and freedom. 90 miles of dangerous territory filled with slave catchers, their dogs, and people who would gladly turn in a runaway for the reward. Harriet had one advantage. She had spent years working in the timber fields and knew the land well. She understood how to read the stars, how to move through the woods silently, and how to survive on very little. But she also needed help, and she found it through the Underground Railroad, that secret network of safe houses and brave individuals who helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Her first stop was the home of a white woman who Harriet had heard was friendly to runaways. The woman gave Harriet directions to the next safe house and a piece of paper with names on it. Harriet couldn't read well, but she memorized the names and followed the directions. From there, she was passed from station to station, hiding in barns, attics, and root cellars during the day, traveling only at night. The journey took weeks and tested every ounce of Harriet's courage and endurance. She waded through cold streams to throw off the scent of tracking dogs. She hid in haystacks and beneath false floors and wagons. She went days without proper food, surviving on whatever scraps the station masters could provide. And always, there was the fear of capture, the knowledge that if she was caught, she would face severe punishment and likely be sold far south, where escape would be impossible. But Harriet kept moving north, driven by an iron determination and a faith that God was guiding her steps. She followed the North Star, waded through swamps, and pushed through exhaustion and pain. And finally, in the autumn of 1849, she crossed the border into Pennsylvania. She was free. Years later, Harriet would describe that moment of crossing into freedom. She said she looked at her hands to see if she was the same person, that the sun came up like gold through the trees, and she felt like she was in heaven. But the joy was incomplete. She was free, but her family remained in bondage. Her parents, her siblings, her friends, all were still enslaved. As she later said, "I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land." Most people who escaped slavery stayed in the North, grateful to be free and unwilling to risk the dangers of returning south. But Harriet Tubman was not most people. Within a year of her own escape, she was planning her first rescue mission. In December 1850, she returned to Maryland to bring out her niece and her niece's 2 children. The mission was successful, and it was just the beginning. Over the next decade, Harriet Tubman would make approximately 19 trips back into slave territory, leading more than 70 people to freedom. She would become the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, known by the code name Moses because, like the biblical Moses, she led her people out of bondage. Each journey was a calculated risk. Harriet planned meticulously, gathering intelligence about patrols and safe houses, timing her rescues to coincide with moments when pursuit would be difficult. She often started journeys on Saturday nights because newspapers announcing runaways wouldn't be published until Monday, giving her group a 2-day head start. She carried a pistol, not just to defend against slave catchers, but also to use on any escapee who lost their nerve and wanted to turn back, potentially endangering the entire group. Harriet's methods were practical and effective. She used disguises, sometimes dressing as an old woman or a man to avoid recognition. She carried drugs to quiet crying babies whose noise might give away a hiding place. She had a network of contacts throughout Maryland and the routes north, people who would hide her groups and provide food and transportation. She knew every trick and every danger, and she used her knowledge to outwit those who hunted her. The people she rescued were often family members and friends from her old life in slavery. In 1851, she returned to rescue one of her brothers and 2 other men. In 1857, she made one of her most daring rescues, bringing out her elderly parents, both in their 70s. Her father was at risk of arrest for helping enslaved people escape, and Harriet knew she had to get him to safety. She built a crude wagon, placed her parents in it, and drove them all the way to freedom, an extraordinary feat considering their age and the danger involved. Not all of Harriet's attempts to rescue family members were successful. Her husband, John Tubman, had remarried after her escape, and when Harriet returned to Maryland to offer him the chance to come north, he refused. She also tried multiple times to rescue her sister Rachel and Rachel's 2 children, but these attempts failed. Rachel died in slavery, one of Harriet's greatest sorrows and a reminder that even her remarkable courage and skill couldn't save everyone. By the mid-1850s, Harriet Tubman's reputation was growing. Slave owners in Maryland put up rewards for her capture, with some sources claiming the total rewards reached as high as $40,000, though this figure is likely exaggerated. What's certain is that she was one of the most wanted fugitives in the South, and that slave owners saw her as a serious threat to their property and their system. But Harriet had supporters in the North. She became connected with leading abolitionists of the time, people like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Thomas Garrett. These abolitionists helped fund her rescue missions and provided safe houses along her routes. Frederick Douglass, himself a former slave who had escaped to freedom, wrote admiringly of Harriet, saying that while he had received much public attention for his work, Harriet had done more than anyone to lead enslaved people to freedom, and she had done it quietly, without fanfare or recognition. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 made Harriet's work even more dangerous. This law required citizens in free states to assist in capturing fugitive slaves and imposed harsh penalties on anyone who helped them escape. It also meant that escaped slaves were not safe even in the northern states. Federal marshals could hunt them down and return them to slavery. In response, Harriet began taking the people she rescued all the way to Canada, where slavery had been abolished and where American slave catchers had no authority. The journey to Canada was much longer and more arduous than the journey to Pennsylvania or New York. It meant traveling through multiple states, hiding for weeks, and enduring even greater hardship. But Harriet was determined that the people she rescued would be truly free beyond the reach of the Fugitive Slave Act. She established contacts in upstate New York and made St. Catharines, Ontario, her primary destination, the same town where our previous story's Sarah had settled. Harriet's faith remained central to her work throughout these years. She believed absolutely that God was protecting her and guiding her missions. She paid attention to her dreams and visions, sometimes changing her plans based on what she believed were divine warnings. This spiritual conviction gave her a confidence that inspired the people she was rescuing. If Harriet said they would make it to freedom, they believed her because she seemed to have an unshakable certainty about her mission. Stories of Harriet's exploits spread throughout the enslaved community in Maryland and beyond. She became a legend, a figure of hope who proved that escape was possible. But with fame came increased danger. By the late 1850s, Harriet knew that her time as a conductor was becoming more limited. The rewards for her capture were substantial, and slave owners were more vigilant. She began to think about the larger struggle against slavery and how else she might contribute. When John Brown, the radical abolitionist, began planning his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, he sought out Harriet Tubman. He called her General Tubman and wanted her help in recruiting supporters and planning the raid. Harriet supported Brown's goals and helped him make contacts, but illness prevented her from participating in the actual raid. When Brown's raid failed and he was executed, Harriet mourned him as a martyr to the cause of freedom. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the subsequent secession of Southern states brought the nation to the brink of civil war. For Harriet and other abolitionists, the coming war represented both a terrible tragedy and a potential opportunity. If the war led to the end of slavery, then perhaps all the struggle and sacrifice would finally achieve its ultimate goal. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Harriet immediately saw ways she could contribute. She traveled to South Carolina, where she worked as a nurse, treating wounded soldiers, both black and white. She used her knowledge of herbal medicine, learned from her mother and other enslaved people, to treat dysentery and other diseases that killed more soldiers than bullets did. But Harriet's most significant contribution to the war effort came as a scout and spy for the Union Army. Her knowledge of covert operations, her ability to move through dangerous territory undetected, and her network of contacts in the South made her invaluable to Union commanders. She became one of the first women to lead an armed expedition in the war. In June 1863, Harriet guided Union forces in a raid along the Combahee River in South Carolina. She had spent weeks scouting the area, identifying Confederate positions and locations of mines planted in the river. Leading about 300 black soldiers, Harriet guided the raid that destroyed Confederate supplies and infrastructure. But the raid's most significant achievement was the liberation of more than 700 enslaved people, who fled to the Union gunboats as they passed. The Combahee River Raid was a triumph and made Harriet the first woman to lead a major military operation in American history. The freed people were offered the chance to join the Union Army or find safety behind Union lines. It was a massive blow to the Confederate war effort and a validation of everything Harriet had fought for. Throughout the war, Harriet continued to serve in various capacities. She worked as a cook, a nurse, a scout, and a spy. She never received official military pay for her service, despite her significant contributions. The government bureaucracy didn't quite know what to make of this black woman who had done so much for the Union cause, and she would spend decades after the war fighting for the pension she deserved. When the war ended in 1865 and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States, Harriet had lived to see the cause of her life's work achieved. Slavery, the institution that had brutalized her and millions of others, was finally destroyed. The people she had risked her life to rescue were now free, not as fugitives hiding in Canada, but as citizens of the United States with legal protection. After the war, Harriet settled in Auburn, New York, where she had purchased property before the war with the help of Senator William Seward. She brought her parents to live with her and created a home for herself and her extended family. In 1869, she married Nelson Davis, a Civil War veteran much younger than herself, and they lived together until his death in 1888. But Harriet didn't retire from public life. She became active in the women's suffrage movement, working alongside Susan B. Anthony and other leaders to secure voting rights for women. She saw the fight for women's rights as connected to the fight for racial justice, both struggles against oppression and for human dignity. She gave speeches at suffrage conventions, always connecting her experiences as an enslaved woman to the broader struggle for equality. Harriet also worked to support the aged and indigent former slaves who had nowhere to go. She turned her own home into an informal care center, taking in those who had no one else. Eventually, with the help of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, she established the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, which opened in 1908 and continued to serve the community for years after her death. Despite her incredible service to the nation, Harriet struggled financially for most of her life. The government was slow to recognize her contributions and even slower to compensate her for them. She finally received a pension, but as the widow of Nelson Davis rather than for her own military service. It took until 1899 for her to receive a pension of $20 per month for her own work during the war, a pittance compared to what she deserved. Harriet lived into her 90s, becoming an icon of the abolitionist movement and the struggle for freedom. Visitors came to Auburn to meet the legendary Moses, to hear her stories, and to pay their respects to a woman who had changed history. She remained sharp and engaged until near the end of her life, still fighting for causes she believed in, still speaking out against injustice. On March 10, 1913, Harriet Tubman died of pneumonia in the rest home she had founded. She was approximately 91 years old, though the exact date of her birth was never known. Her funeral was a major event, attended by local dignitaries and Civil War veterans who honored her with a military salute. She was buried with military honors in Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn. Harriet Tubman's legacy extends far beyond the approximately 70 people she directly led to freedom. She became a symbol of resistance, courage, and the fight for justice. Her life demonstrated that one person, even someone born into slavery, even someone who suffered from a disability, could change the world through determination and courage. The stories of her 19 trips in enslaved territory became legendary, inspiring generations of activists and freedom fighters. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, activists invoked her name and her example. When freedom riders risked their lives to challenge segregation, they were following in the footsteps of Harriet Tubman. When voting rights activists braved violence to register black voters in the South, they were channeling her courage. Harriet's life also challenges us to think about who gets remembered in history. For many years, her story was marginalized or forgotten, considered less important than the stories of male leaders and politicians. It took decades of work by historians, particularly black historians and women historians, to rescue her story from obscurity and give her the recognition she deserved. Today, Harriet Tubman is finally receiving some of the honors she should have received during her lifetime. Her image was selected to appear on the $20 bill, replacing Andrew Jackson, though this change has yet to be implemented. National parks and historic sites preserve her memory. Schools and institutions bear her name. She has become an iconic American figure, recognized alongside the Founding Fathers and other national heroes. But beyond the official recognition, Harriet Tubman's story continues to inspire anyone who faces injustice and refuses to accept it. She showed that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. She demonstrated that one person, armed with nothing but determination and faith, can make an extraordinary difference. She proved that the most marginalized people in society, those whom the powerful dismiss as insignificant, can become agents of historic change. Harriet Tubman's famous statement, "I never ran my train off the track," and "I never lost a passenger," reflects the pride she took in her work. In an era when most conductors on the Underground Railroad remained anonymous for their own safety, Harriet became Moses, because her success was undeniable. Slave owners feared her, abolitionists celebrated her, and the people she rescued revered her. She operated in a world where she had every excuse to fail. She was a woman in an era when women had few rights. She was black in a nation that enslaved and oppressed black people. She was illiterate and suffered from a debilitating medical condition. She had no money, no political power, and no social standing. Yet she accomplished what many thought impossible, not once but 19 times, and in doing so, she struck blow after blow against the institution of slavery. Harriet Tubman's life reminds us that history is not made only by presidents and generals, by the wealthy and the powerful. It is made by ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things. It is made by a young woman standing alone in the Maryland woods, deciding that freedom is worth any risk. It is made by the decision to return to danger again and again to help others. It is made by the accumulation of brave acts, small and large, that eventually changed the world. The railroad that Harriet Tubman conducted was underground, secret, and illegal. But it was also a railroad to freedom, to dignity, to human rights. Every person she led north was a victory against slavery, a refutation of the idea that some people are meant to be owned by others. Every successful journey was proof that the system of slavery, no matter how powerful it seemed, could be resisted and defeated. When we think of Harriet Tubman today, we should remember not just her extraordinary courage, but also her persistence, her faith, her strategic brilliance, and her absolute commitment to the cause of freedom. We should remember that she didn't have to return to the South even once, let alone 19 times. She could have lived quietly in freedom, grateful for her own escape. But she chose a different path. She chose to risk everything again and again for others. That choice, repeated 19 times over a decade, makes Harriet Tubman one of the greatest American heroes. Her story is a testament to the power of the human spirit, to the possibility of resistance against oppression, and to the truth that freedom is never free but must be fought for, often at great personal cost, by those brave enough to demand it. This has been Moses of her people, the Harriet Tubman story. Thank you for listening.